Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a review of a clever filter solution for a number of wide-angle lenses. Of course, getting filters on some wide-angle lenses is the single greatest challenge, and I recently reviewed this Irix 15mm f2.4 lens, and it's actually better than most in that you can actually use front filters on it. It is filter threaded, though at a very large 95mm, and it also had a rear gel filter setup. Now, the biggest problem typically with gel type filters is that they tend to be cheap in every sense of the word. They're inexpensive, but unfortunately a lot of hardcore landscape photographers, for example, or those that will shoot, stylish architectural work where they're using long exposure, they're not a fan of gel filters because they're also cheap in the sense of optically they deliver fairly poor results often, and so there's a breakdown in both resolution, and then on top of that there is also often a serious issue with color cast being introduced, and those typically either are magenta colored or in some cases they'll be heavily kind of blue and create a very cool final result. Aurora Aperture has stepped into that void by creating their PowerND line, and Aurora Aperture has kind of carved out a reputation for themselves by creating, high quality filters of various kinds, be screw-on filter or, square filters, or in this case, rear mount filter setups. And so they've got a great reputation for good optics, good products used in construction, but then also being moderately priced. I was really intrigued about this setup, and they actually reached out to me at some point very early in the year. But at the time, I didn't have any lens on hand that their rear mount filter setup would go for. Now they do. They also have them in Canon versions, and there's a number of Canon lenses that come with a a gel filter holder. So there's typically two major issues that you'll run into with these ND filters. So number one, they do tend to introduce color cast, and I've used from a number of different manufacturers, and I've never seen one that is without any kind of color cast at all. Second issue that typically pops up with front mount filters is that you begin to have an issue with vignette, in that the edges of the frame, and the longer exposure you go, the more evident it becomes, the more that there is a heavy vignette along the edges of the frame. This rear mount filter actually helps to eliminate both of those issues, and I've been really impressed by how little vignette is introduced into images. In fact, I've not had to do any kind of extra vignette correction at all. And since I'm typically shooting at smaller apertures, f5.6, f8, f11, where there isn't really a lot of natural vignette on the Irix lens, that as a byproduct of that, I'm finding that I'm not even doing any kind of correction for vignette, which is really unusual in my experience with that. And so let's look at the process here for a moment. As I've noted, there are a number of wide-angle lenses, including this one, that come with a rear mount gel filter set. So what the Irix kit does is it actually, for one thing, that typically those rear mount filter setups are just in plastic. They're not all that high end. And so number one, you're replacing the rear filter mount holder with something that is made of a higher end material. It's actually a CNC aluminum alloy. And so number one, you're going to a much higher grade of material. And then also you're replacing it with a filter holder that can actually allow you to use a much higher end optical glass type filter as opposed to a cheap gel filter going in there. And so part of that design is that there is a kind of a felt or soft touch surface that the filters slide onto, so you're eliminating any possibility of scratching them. Now, as far as replacing out the existing Irix filter with the Aurora Aperture PowerND filter holder, I mean, they give you the tools. It's a little screwdriver that does seem to have some magnetic ability there because it holds the screws without them falling off, kind of the main issue that I find with working with very fine screws. And so a byproduct of that is that literally it took me 5 minutes to do the replacement job. Very simple. Unscrewing 3 screws. It tells you which one to line up here, and you're actually replacing it with 2 screws that are going in, and you're actually putting one of the original screws back in, and that becomes kind kind of a friction point that helps to hold it, and then you're anchoring it on either end with 2 other screws. And you're going to do something like this, you need to be smart on the surface that you do it on, and so it eliminates losing very small screws. But fortunately, they were smart enough to include some extras for those that either make an inadvertent mistake or they're not quite as smart in their preps they should have. But anyway, for me, I'm not any kind of professional with this kind of thing. You know, I'm not a jeweler or anything. I was able to do it in 5 minutes. No big deal, seriously. And so then let's talk about the filters themselves. And so what you have inside the kit, and I've got one of them on the camera right now, but inside you've got 4 different filters that are included. Now, as I mentioned, these are actual high-end optical glass filter. In fact, they're made out of Gorilla Glass, which is the same, you know, high-end glass that's used like in smartphone screens or higher-end smartphone screens. And so it's already, you know, very strong, it's durable, it's resistant to, you know, scratching and shattering, etc. But on top of that, they have tons of layers of nano coatings that are going over the top of that. Now, nano coatings help with both with the, you know, the light reduction to create the ND effect, but it also provides a surface protection for it, and so it gives you protection against moisture and oil and dust, fingerprints, you know, being the main thing there, and so it makes them easy to clean. However, on that note, I would like to see them include some kind of cleaning, you know, little maybe microfiber cleaning cloth right inside the kit itself, because I mean, this is all that you're typically bringing along, and so it's, you know, very compact. But it would have been easy to fit a, you know, an inexpensive for Aurora Aperture to include a cleaning cloth there. But these have so many layers of this nano coating. In fact, they boast 128 layers of nano coating. So, I mean, these are very, very serious optical instruments here. As you can see, very small, very compact. When you think about the size of front end ND filters, I mean, these things are truly tiny. However, because they're made of high-end optical glass, you're getting a completely different result when you go to take the shots. And I'll come back to that in just a second. Now, so as noted, it comes with the filter holder, and it comes within the kit 4 different ND filters. That includes an ND8 filter, which is a 3-stop filter, an ND64, which is a 6-stop filter, an ND4000, which is a 12-stop filter, and then an ND6500, which is a 16-stop filter. Now, personally, I would like to have seen, for me, kind of a sweet spot for most of the long exposures that I like to do is actually closer to an ND1000, which is a 10-stop filter. And so just as a recommendation, I would love to see them kind of repackage this kit and have the, you know, the ND1000 included, and then use the ND4000 as the top-end filter. I mean, frankly, even with an ND4000 in the conditions that I typically shoot at, and that's sometimes even in the middle of the day, you're already talking about like 5-minute type exposures, and that's not even going to the 16 filter, you know, top of the filter kit. And so, you know, byproduct of that is that I find that it's almost too much. And so far, I haven't even used the ND 6500. And of course, or I shouldn't say 6500, it's 65,000. Your mileage may vary on that, you know, depending on what you're doing, but I just find that to be overkill in most circumstances. And so, yeah, I would prefer to see the ND 4000 as the top end and to throw in an ND 1000 instead. Of course, that's not the case. Now, a couple of things that you're going to have to become familiar with, you know, in doing this. Number one, you're going to have to become familiar with using bulb mode on your camera. And, you know, your typical 30-second exposure when you're going into these heavier filters. ND 6400, or excuse me, ND 64, I should say, the 6-stop. In many situations, you will be able to use that within just your typical, you know, manual mode, for example, and setting that aperture. And you'll even be able, in a number of lighting conditions, to be able to actually recreate the conditions. You know, if you compensate in live view, you're typically able to recreate the lighting and see what you would like to see. when you go beyond that, the screen is mostly going to be blacked out, and just the camera cannot compensate for that kind of amount of light being cut down. And so you're going to have to become familiar with either downloading a chart, or there are apps that will help you to calculate neutral density and long exposure type times based on a base exposure. And so that can help. This is also a trial and error type thing. You really have to develop some skills, some understanding, and knowing how this works. But I actually was surprised. I found that the ND4000 to take a little bit longer exposure time than what I anticipated, even when using chart or experience. And so it definitely cuts a lot of light, which is another reason why I think that the ND65000 is probably overkill, and I'd like to see another step below. So another thing that probably is smart to consider is, you know, maybe some kind of remote shutter release. I'm in the process of reviewing this Velo Shutter Boss. This is a remote release, and I like this a lot because as you're doing a long exposure, it actually is giving you a readout on the screen. You know, just sitting there and watching a 5, 6, 7, 8 minute exposure is much less fun than what you might think. And so being able to, you know, just kind of have a readout. Like yesterday I was shooting some, and so while I was having the exposure run by, I was, you know, just wandering off doing other things, and I just looked down periodically at where I was, and I could just stop the exposure when I wanted. So you're going to have to become familiar with that. A few other tips for you doing long exposures, by the way, is number one, you know, remember that subject movement's going to be an issue. So, you know, for example, a lot of trees, particularly if there's any kind of wind, doesn't always work all that well because there is going to be movement there. So things like that are going to be somewhat stagnant, I find, like, you know, for example, rocks in the middle of moving water. They work really well because the rock is not blowing around. Buildings often work well for long exposure for that reason, because you're introducing a static element, you know, that's going to stay still, and then, you know, capturing movement around it. So that's one thing to watch out for. You need to, you know, learn how to choose the right kinds of subjects. Second thing to watch out for is hot pixels, and that's just an unfortunate reality of doing very long exposures. As you can see here, you'll get some pixels that will light up, you know, often red. And so one thing that I find helps, if those linger, they typically don't, but if they linger into regular shooting, if you'll put the lens cap on and do a, you know, just go in manual mode and put it to a 30-second exposure with the cap on, you're going to get a completely black image, but it does help to remap those pixels. And so not necessarily an issue long term, just you need to know how to deal with it. One final thing to note as a part of that is that when you're using the heavier filters, the ND4000 or the ND65000, they can introduce some focus shift. And so, you know, if you've just pre-focused with no filter on there, your filter may not be, or your focus may not be perfect. And so either, you know, employ some hyperfocal technique, or an alternate is that you can put on, say, the ND8 filter or the ND64 filter. You can focus, you can still see enough to focus with those on, and often you can even use autofocus if you're using an autofocusing lens. You turn off focus at that point. If you're manually focusing, you're careful while you take the lens off. And so in the case of the Irix, I like to unmount by just gripping the front. The other thing with the Irix is you do have the advantage of the lock ring. And so this is where that lock ring can come in handy. And so then you can remove that, you can swap out the filter, and then you can put that back on, put it back on your tripod, and, you know, you've got your results. So finally, let me talk about the image quality itself. This is where I'm really impressed by the approach that Aurora Aperture has done. Like I said earlier on, a lot of the typical issues with ND filters are eliminated. Number one, the issue of Vignette is a non-issue because it's a little tiny filter at the very back. There is no mechanical obstruction to come into play at all, and so that's fantastic. I mean, and that solves one of the huge problems with ND filters, and so that's a big plus right there. Another huge plus here is the quality of the optical glass and the coatings. It has produced the lowest amount of color cast that I have ever seen. And frankly, there is very little variance between using the different filters or using no filter at all. And so byproduct of that is I'm very impressed. The final thing that I'm very impressed by is the sheer amount of detail that is preserved. Sometimes ND filters, you do have a loss of detail or of resolution. I'm finding that that is very, very minimal with this PowerND kit from Aurora Aperture. I'm very impressed by that. And as you can see from this crop, even this is an exposure that's something like 4, almost 5 minutes long. But yet you can see that the detail is still excellent. This is at f5.6. And so you can see that detail has been preserved. In fact, the only time that I've really seen any kind of loss of detail is when I am underestimating how long my exposure needs to be. I've got some really cool images that came out of the camera underexposed. I did recovery in post, and these days, because of the dynamic range of cameras, you can do that fairly successfully. Your downside is, of course, is that if you're really recovering shadows, for example, you do introduce a little bit more noise and a little bit of loss of detail. That's not really the filter's fault. That is becoming familiar with, this, for example, the ND4000 filter behaving a little bit more heavily. I would estimate that it's actually behaving more like a 13 or 14 stop filter than it is a 12 stop, at least from what I can observe personally. So anyway, that's certainly some pluses there. So optically, they've done a fantastic job. The other thing too is the sheer convenience of bringing along this 4 filters. The filter holder is already right there on the lens. It's not in the way. It doesn't obstruct anything. You don't even have to think about it. It's just mounted back there. And so you're not bringing along anything that's big and bulky. Finally, let's talk about price. The price for this is at around $250 US. And so not inexpensive, but when you're looking at the cost of alternatives, filter holders, high-end optical filters, it's a relative value, and it seems expensive mostly because of how small everything is. But again, if you're comparing it to what you would have to do with a different type system, it's really not expensive at all. And yes, it's more expensive than gel filters, but I mean, we're not even talking about anywhere close to being the same kind of optical performance. The gel filters are not worth using. These very much are. They're as good as anything that I've used before. And so at the end of the day, I think that's a huge plus. Final downside is not every lens, unfortunately, can take these. Not every lens is designed to take a rear filter holder, and so you're limited by that. But I'm encouraged, for example, Tamron's about to release a G2 version of the 15 to 30 millimeter f2.8, a lens that I love. And they have added on a rear filter holder. Sigma just released a 14 to 24 millimeter f2.8 art lens, a fantastic lens. And it also has a rear filter holder. So, I mean, I think that manufacturers are recognizing the value of that, and I am very confident that Aurora Aperture is going to step in and give you a high-end solution rather than using, cheaper rear filters there. So a lot of pluses there, and I'm happy to give a recommendation to this if you are looking for a filter kit and you've got one of these lenses that it will work for. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you look in the description down below, I've shown you, some images as a part of this. But if you look in the description down below, I do have an image gallery that I'll be adding images to. And so, the byproduct is that, it's great to be able to go from a relatively boring image, and as you go into heavier ND filters, introduce more and more drama in the movement of water or the sky, and so delivering a really cool end result. And so take a look there, and I've got lots of options for you to look at. And of course, you can find some buying links here if you'd like to purchase them for yourself. And as always, you can follow me on social media, become a patron, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.